I don't need it? Is that what you said?
No, put it up here.
Oh. Welcome, 2018 Rocky Mountain Smiths Blacksmithing Conference, number XXVIII.
Nice.
Hey, Mike. Turn on your mic.
It is on.
Is it?
I guess.
Replace the battery.
It's a red light on. Is that better? Or would you rather I just shut up?
Don't tempt us.
A couple of announcements. You got to be wearing safety glasses if you're in the shop, especially during the demonstrations. If you need a pair, we have some over here on that table, and we have ear protection there if you need it. Please don't park on the road. It's a fire right away there, fire truck right away. What else? The gallery is in the barn. The gallery is in the barn. Go over there and check it out. If you brought some work, put it in there. We have Iron in the Hat tickets. Evan Blackstock here is selling tickets. Buy tickets. Buy more tickets. Buy them often. Let's see, what else have we got? We're starting out this morning with a man who's a good friend of ours, Peter Ross. Hails from Siler City, North Carolina. He was the master blacksmith at Colonial Williamsburg for many years. He is one of, if not the guy, to go to learn about colonial work, 18th century ironwork, and we're so happy to have him back again. Please join me in welcoming Peter Ross.
Two more announcements.
Dan has an announcement.
Mike, this was found near the dorms. Anybody lose a set of keys? What kind of car is it?
Yeah.
Well, there's two of them. Find out. We got a Nissan and a Fiat. Also, Jim Creel is closed down his shop, and he's got a lot of equipment for sale. I've got here a whole stack of photographs of the equipment that's for sale with a little description and a price on it. And I'll sit it outside by the t-shirts if you want to take a look. Please don't take the photos. Just take a picture of the photo if you want that. Okay, Peter.
Thank you, Dan. All right. My mic on? Everyone can hear? If I mumble under my... everyone can hear that too? Uh-oh, well, now I'm in trouble. All right, so well, thank you very much for having me back. I always enjoy coming out here and learning what low humidity means again. So it rained 2 inches the other night at my house. That was the 5th 2-inch rain we've had in 2 weeks. And everything is soggy. The house got mildewed on the outside. And it's anyway. So delightful to be here, cool at night. It's a real vacation. It's too bad I have to come in here and work and get dirty, but otherwise it's been great. So thanks again to Scott for working on all the arrangements, and glad to be here. And for Mike for getting me up here. And John for helping get some of the tools ready last night. So it's all been great. So I always go blank when people say, can you come demonstrate? What would you like to do? And then I just go completely blank. So in the end, we decided I could revisit a topic that we've covered here before, but many years ago, and that is the style of Baroque English scroll work and architectural work that was common not only in England but in Europe in the mid-1700s up until probably third quarter 1700s anyway. And this piece I'm passing around, can hold that up in the air for a second. that's the piece that we're going to focus on, and I'll tell you a little bit about its history. There are two of these surviving in one of the houses in Williamsburg, and they're set side by side on the wall in the sort of central hall of the house, and there's a marble slab resting on the top. And they were made to be used as side tables for serving food and entertaining and what have you. So they were called slab table brackets, and they're not very common. There probably were maybe a dozen of these in colonial America. The set that's in Williamsburg, the story goes, they were brought by a Scottish bride when she came to America with her Williamsburg-born husband in about 1768, 1770. And she brought these from her Scottish parents' home. So they were apparently taken down out of the house in Scotland, brought to America, and set up in this house, and they're still there. So it's pretty cool survival.
These are reproductions.
The ones we're looking at are reproductions, yes. Yeah, the originals are, well, they're not mine, first of all, and second, far too valuable to get passed around and slobbered on like this. Yeah.
Is that house one that belongs to the park or one of the private houses?
The house belongs to Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. It's not open for tours. So let me tell you a little bit about Williamsburg and my time there, and that'll maybe give you some context for how I'm going to talk about this stuff. So I worked at Colonial Williamsburg for 25 years. I was the master of the blacksmith shop for 23 of those years. And it's a nonprofit corporation. It's a very rare kind of situation in America. It was actually the capital city of Virginia from 1699 until the middle of the Revolutionary War. So it was a real town. And then the capital, there was a threat, a military threat to the capital in 1780, and so in a flurry of panic, they moved the capital inland to Richmond to hopefully keep it from being sort of ransacked by the British, who had control of the water on the coast of America during the war. So they moved the capital to Richmond, where it still is now, and so Williamsburg ceased to be the important political center of the colony or the state. That was really its only reason for prominence. It's not a transportation center, it's not at the crossroads of anything important, it's not a port, doesn't have a good view, doesn't have any good restaurants, nothing. There's nothing to make it, well, in fact, they picked that location to be the capital in 1699 because the current capital was Jamestown, and it's built in a swamp. And so they said, we're done with this swamp, we're going to find a dry place, and they picked the highest point of land they could nearby, which was Williamsburg. It's 80 feet above sea level. So 80, 80, yeah.
8-0. Well, no wonder you get out of breath.
Yeah. So that's on the drainage divide for the peninsula that it's on. So Williamsburg was the driest spot. There was already a college there, the College of William and Mary. There was supposedly already a blacksmith shop there and an ordinary, a tavern. So that was the critical mass, I guess, for picking a capital city location. And that's where it was. So anyway, once they moved the capital, there was really nothing left there to make Williamsburg prosper. And so it didn't. It just stayed pretty much the same for the next 150 years. And in the 1920s, well, you know, there's something happened, something kind of important happened in July 1776. Anyway, every 50, well, after 100 years after that, there was a huge celebration we called the Centennial. Big celebration in Philadelphia. The 150th anniversary, there was great celebration and revival of interest in colonial things, early American things, early American politics. And so in the 1920s, one of the Rockefellers essentially bought up the town to preserve it before it got modernized. Because in this town were still 90 or 100 18th century buildings that hadn't been altered much. And so this was one of the few towns that could be sort of restored to its 18th century appearance without, without having to rebuild the whole thing. And Williamsburg, being the capital in the lead up to the Revolutionary War, was the home of a number of important political events. So the Virginia legislature included Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, George Wythe, another Declaration of Independence signer. Some prominent names were Virginia politicians at the time, and a lot of important events kind of were formulated there. So, so that's why they picked Williamsburg. And essentially it got bought up by Rockefeller, and then the houses were all purchased one at a time, and it became a nonprofit corporation with the mission of preserving what was there and sort of portraying what it might have been like in the years before the Revolutionary War. So that's the place. When I worked there, my job was to make the things that were needed by the rest of the museum. So there were 25 other trades shops, wheelwrights, shoemakers, gunsmiths, on and on and on. They all needed the correct kinds of tools for 1770. There are not too many other people making them, and so that was part of my job. The other part was to try to figure out how those things had been made in 1770 and try to relearn that process. So you could certainly make here's a typical pair of compasses, for example, from that era. You could, nowadays you could make these on a CNC machine. And if you were really good at it, you could get pretty close to original appearance. But that wasn't really the goal. The goal was to try to figure out how they had been made and try to relearn the skills well enough to duplicate the process as well as the product. So both those things were important. And then, of course, you could show that to tourists. So they could, there are a lot of people who would say, oh, I'd love to see a CNC machine making one of these, but there are more tourists who would say, I'd love to see a blacksmith making one of these the way they used to do it. So that was our goal, and that was our appeal and challenge. So I can talk more at some point about some of the other kinds of things we made. Well, actually, I brought a couple with me, and we can pass some of these around too. So here's some hardware. These cooking utensils I've made up. They're made in the style of, but they're not actual copies of any old stuff. And here are a couple things: a lock and a latch. Yeah. Yeah. So these are typical of the goods that you'd find being made and used at that time. And I've talked about this often before, but I think it's really important to say again. When these things were being made in 1770, if you went to look at one of these in the store and the storekeeper said, those are handmade, how much of a big deal do you think that was back then? Who cares? Everything's handmade. You know, what's the big deal? Get over it, they would say. So there's no novelty back then for something being handmade, and there's nothing about handmade that automatically makes it special. And so that's a very different environment than most of everyone here today is accustomed to thinking about. Most people today are sort of riding this wave of, oh, it's handmade, so it must be wonderful. Handmade by itself implies special, unusual, incredible, soul, enriching, wallet enriching. Anyway, all of the attributes that people today associate with handmade didn't apply at all. And so the style or the aesthetic for making these things back then did not make attempt to emphasize the thing being handmade. And often, in fact, if there's some evidence of it being handmade, you want to get rid of that, because to make a piece and leave marks and leave evidence is the lowest level of skill. So if I work on a bar of iron, I can give this piece of iron to my 10-year-old grandson and say, put hammer marks on that. And he can do that in the dark with his eyes closed without ever having known what a hammer was before that moment. That doesn't take any skill at all. And so you want to show skill, you want to raise your work above the lowest possible level of appreciation. You want to do it in a way that takes more skill, and that means making a cleaner, smoother, more regular result, because that takes more skill than making an irregular one does. I'm talking about the forging skill. I'm not talking about aesthetic design or style necessarily. So that was the sort of aesthetic. That was the standard of quality for those days. Is that pieces that are forged smooth and clean. A forged surface is the lowest grade surface for ironwork. If you want to get a better quality piece, you get rid of the forged surface by filing. And if you want to get rid of that medium grade surface and make a better quality piece, you polish. And if you want to get even better than that, you case harden and polish. And so there are many, many grades of surface, each one better than forging or the one previous. And each one takes a significant amount of labor and sometimes more skill to achieve. So these cooking utensils, a lot of the hardware have filed surfaces, and that was to make them better than the lowest grade. Often they're just filed on the visible part, because that's really what's important, is you making the visible part more uniform, smoother, more regular. And when it's new, bright in color, so it doesn't have that black appearance anymore either. Even if it's going to get painted over, a lot of old hardware gets installed on doors that are going to be painted. They buy better grade hardware, which is filed bright, and then they just paint right over it. So you can still see under the paint that it's not a rough forged surface, and so it's still a visible component, but the brightness, the bright color isn't necessarily the end result, it's the smoother finish. Yeah?
Peter, could you talk to us a little bit about what the material the blacksmith of that period had to work with?
Sure. There are two materials that, well, I kind of harped on this yesterday with some people, but we all use the word blacksmith, but that term historically meant one specific trade. And that generally, that trade was the guy in a town who would do custom work and repairs. And that's really what a blacksmith was, and often shoeing too. You know, and sometimes those guys would call themselves blacksmith and farrier, but often they just call themselves blacksmith, and you look in their account books and there's a significant amount of shoeing. The person that made nails was not a blacksmith, was a nailer. And the person that made locks was not a blacksmith, it was a locksmith. Because generally the blacksmiths didn't make those kinds of things. They could make one or two maybe, but a blacksmith never made 300,000 nails in a year. You've got to be just a nailer to be able to do that. It takes years of making just nails and nothing else to get fast enough to do real nail production. And so the blacksmith is one of, well, probably 15 or 20 iron forging trades. But it's important to remember that this kind of work was not done by a blacksmith either, nor generally were these kinds of everyday carpenter's tools. They were done by special manufacturing smiths. So the smiths that did this kind of work, that made gates and grills and railings, were called palisado smiths. Smiths that made bits and spurs and stirrups were called lorimers. Smiths that made locks were called locksmiths, and sometimes more specialized than that, they were sometimes called padlock makers or stock lock makers. And these are what they called themselves. These are terms they used to describe themselves. If you called yourself a blacksmith, that meant you did kind of repair work, general repair work, and a few custom-made tools, farm tools, wagon parts, household things, but not a quantity manufacturer of anything.
Peter, did they have all those different smiths at Williamsburg, or did the blacksmith do all those different trades?
Well, there's a third option. So were there all those trades in Williamsburg, or did the blacksmith make all those things? And the answer to both those questions is no. Williamsburg had a population of about 2,000, and that was not a big enough community to support a lorimer or a palisado smith. I think there were maybe 2 sets of gates in the whole town. And there wasn't even enough population there to support a nailer. There were, at the time, probably at the peak, about 6 or 7 shops that forged iron in one way or another. And 2 or 3 of them, well, a couple of them were farriers. Several were blacksmiths that did, like I said, repair work, made farm tools, did some shoeing, occasionally would make a key for a lock if you lost a key. Then there were also 1 or 2 smiths called white smiths, whose work meant forged pieces that were sold polished, were sold bright. So a whitesmith made a better grade of product than a blacksmith in terms of finish. and generally the things that you'd find in a fancier house setting, not out in the farm field. So whitesmiths made nicer grades of cooking equipment and fireplace tools and some lighting and some, what else? Well, nothing comes to mind. There was also, there was for a short while, a guy came from England in 1770 and he set up and he called himself, what did he call himself? A gunsmith. And he didn't get enough work apparently, so 6 months later he puts another ad in the paper and he's a gunsmith and blacksmith. And that wasn't enough, and so a year later he put another ad in the paper and he was a gunsmith, blacksmith, and founder. And I think he probably dabbled in all of those things to start with, but where he had come from, which was Birmingham, England, you could be just one of those things and make a living. But in a tiny town, you couldn't just be one of those things. You had to do a little of everything. And so in a bigger city, you would find 15 different trades. In Philadelphia, you would find blacksmiths, whitesmiths, cutlers who made scissors and knives, and maybe even sword cutlers who specialized even further. You'd find whitesmiths, you'd find locksmiths, you'd find maybe palisado smiths, you'd find tire smiths, they were called, the smiths that did all the vehicle hardware, which was, I'm not talking about a buckboard, I'm talking about coaches now, which are very fancy vehicles, and smiths that did that work were often regarded as the best smiths in the field. The requirement for coach ironwork was incredibly fancy and stylish and the lightest possible at the same time. So it was very, very skilled work. So the third option in Williamsburg, because there wasn't enough market to have all those trades, and a blacksmith wasn't knowledgeable enough to make all those things, was to bring the stuff in from somewhere else. And that was probably a big common phenomenon all up and down the East Coast. So Williamsburg is on two rivers that are deep enough for ocean-going vessels. And so there were ships docking near Williamsburg at least every week, 50 or 60 ships a year coming from England with cargoes of manufactured goods, and then bringing the Virginia exports back to England. And those were tobacco and corn and wood in lots of forms, lumber, gun stocks, barrel staves, wheel spokes, all the kinds of things that were needed in manufacturing. They also brought iron from Virginia back to England, because iron was one of the big exports of Virginia, and England couldn't make enough internally to supply their own industry. So the English were importing iron, and getting it from one of their own colonies was the best arrangement they could hope for. What else was exported? Furs, deer skins, beaver, all the kinds of sort of agrarian and basic industrial material products were being exported from Virginia back to England. So people in England were people in Williamsburg were very accustomed to seeing the latest kind of manufactured goods from the biggest industrial centers in England. And they would see them every week. A new ship would come in loaded. So when you live in an environment like that, a local blacksmith who can say, well, I can't make one as nice as this, but I could make one that's a lot cruder and heavier, and oh, I have to charge more too. There's just no incentive for people to go to a local blacksmith and get something like this when you could walk down to the store, buy one that was much better made for a third less money. You know, and why was it better made? Because the guy that made these in England made 100 a week, not one of them every month, but 100 every week, and he could get so good and uniform and consistent at it. So that's why it's important to remember what the blacksmith's role is within this context. And I haven't forgotten your question. What materials did smiths have to work with? They had basically two materials to work with. High carbon steel, which was, you could buy in different grades, and that was suitable for hammer faces or chisel edges or, well, anything that needed to be hardened. Springs, what else? So, well, a lot of agricultural tools are faced with that steel, you know, plow shares or even hoes for hand cultivation, axes. So all those things would have a little piece of high carbon steel in them for the cutting edge or the wear surface. And then the other material is wrought iron. So just those two. And they suffice for every single ferrous metal thing that's forged. And then the other material that was available at the time, that ferrous metal, was cast iron. And so there are a bunch of things that are normally made of cast iron. Big cooking kettles and pots, those are the ones that are easy to imagine. Firebacks, which are just the thick cast iron plate you set against the back wall of your fireplace to help radiate heat and keep the fire from deteriorating the brick. Yeah?
Did the high carbon steel come from England, or did they manufacture it here?
I think all the steel came from England. I don't think there was any significant steel manufacturer in the American colonies. And, you know, I've just found this book from 1851 called The Manufacture of Steel, and even in 1851, the author says there's almost no steel made in America. So steel making was not a really well-developed industry in America until probably up till the Civil War period. But when you're talking about what kinds of things were being forged at the time, probably the, you know, wrought iron, you know, of all the material that's used in a year, for example, in a shop that's doing work like this, wrought iron would be 99% of the material and steel might be 1%. So it's a very small amount, and it was really expensive. So a tool like a hammer would just have a thin face of steel on each end. And the majority of the material is iron.
Do you ever find those hammers, steel-faced hammers?
Occasionally, well, you can find them in antique stores often, but it's hard to tell how old they are when you find them that way. So what we really hoped for were archaeological finds. And I think probably we have 3 or 4 archaeological hammers with steel faces. And then, well, at Mount Vernon, they found the face off of one. Came off. It wasn't welded properly, so the face came off after some use, and that ended up in the ground. So that's pretty interesting. So let's see, in that lock, the spring is steel. That's the only piece that's steel. In a common door lock, there's even less steel than there is in that lock. There are 2 springs in a common door lock, and everything else is wrought iron. Well, even in a gun, you know, the amount of steel is minimal. There are 3 springs in the flintlock. Yeah, the frizzen, the mainspring, and the sear spring, and that's all the steel there is in a flintlock.
So the barrel would have been locked?
Barrels were iron.
What was the carbon content of high carbon steel?
Yeah, what was the carbon content of the steel? I have no idea. I don't know anyone that's done an analysis of surviving pieces. It has to be destructive analysis. That's the problem. I know there's been a fair amount of work done on ancient blades, but no one's bothered to do that on tools. So I don't know. My guess is it's somewhere between 50 and 90 points.
Is the thought that it was consistent in, from, if you looked at a dozen axes that all had steel bits in it, would the carbon content of those be consistent, do you suspect?
I suspect they would not be anywhere near consistent. So I think they're really inconsistent. So the way there was one common way to make steel. You would make wrought iron bar, and they called it cementation or cemented. You pack these bars in a box within a furnace. The boxes are stone or iron, and you pack the bars in charcoal, ground up charcoal. And you might put 2 tons of bars in one box at a time. And then you put a lid on it, and you heat up the whole box to glowing, and you hold it there for several days and then let it cool. And the carbon in the charcoal gets absorbed into the iron because it's a lack of oxygen in that environment. And so that was sold just as is. That was called blister steel because it actually raised blisters on the surface of the bar. And it's the most uneven. The surface of the bar generally has more carbon than the core. And so even within you take any section of that bar and it's going to be even throughout its cross section. And maybe uneven along its length as well.
Would it penetrate?
All the way to the center to some degree. Yeah, if you, yeah, yeah. So then people knew that was irregular. They didn't know, they didn't know it was carbon that was the issue. Because there really wasn't atomic theory at that point. So they thought, actually, if you read early, middle 1700s metallurgy books, they assume that the iron is being purified in order to make steel because it's a brighter color and it's a more homogeneous material. So there wasn't even the idea that you were adding something to iron to make it into steel. Their theory was the opposite. You were taking something out of iron to make steel. So they had no way really of analyzing this other than by a visual inspection. You could quench that bar and break it, and you could see that it was different on the surface and the core. And you could tell by working it too. So they knew it was irregular, but it was the lowest price. That's the lowest price steel you can buy. If you want better steel, we can improve it several ways. You're going to cost more to do that. And the first way they could do that was to fold that bar and weld the stack and draw it back out again. Or they would actually cut up the bar and stack it and weld it. But that was called shear steel. So if you do that once, you take that bar and you shear it up into 4 or 5 pieces and stack it and weld it and draw it all out back to the same dimension. That's shear steel, single shear. You could do it again, cut that welded stack it up again, weld it again, and draw it out again. That was double shear. That was more uniform than single shear. And then the best way of making the steel homogeneous back then was to take the original blister steel and put it in a crucible and remelt it, and not add or subtract anything, just melt it. And then you have a homogeneous mix of whatever was in there to start with. And then you get an ingot from that melt, which you would forge into bar. And that was called cast steel. And if you guys, any of you, find old tools, a lot of them will say, stamped right on them, cast steel. Well, that was the best grade of steel at the time, and so that's an advertisement for the quality of the tool you're buying. It doesn't mean the tool is cast. It means the process for making the steel was cast steel, and then subsequently everything is forged. And you still have a cast steel bit forge welded onto an iron tool body, just like you could do the same procedure with blister steel, or you could do the same procedure with shear steel. So cast steel just gave the most uniform results, and people knew that by trial, not by analysis.
So they were, when they did the blister steel, that was pure iron, not wrought.
It was wrought iron.
So it had some.
It had silica in it, right? In it.
So is that staying, that's still there?
I don't know the answer for that completely. My understanding is some of the silica comes out. You still have a grain in the bar, but it's not as pronounced as the grain in the wrought iron bar was.
But if you did the cast steel, you probably would.
No grain in cast steel, no visible, laminar grain. And if you make shear steel out of that blister steel, you still have grain, visible grain in the steel. That's just more evenly distributed. So if you can find, if you look at old iron tools a lot, you can find tools that are marked shear steel. And if you etch the steel in those, you can see the grain that looks like wrought iron grain. But it's really, that blade is steel. It's got carbon in it. So yeah, some of the steel did have grain. It made that steel much easier to weld to a piece of iron or to itself. So people talk about how much easier it is to weld cast steel weld blister steel and shear steel than it is to weld cast steel. Not only would it weld more securely, but it could be heated to a higher temperature also without damage. So the cast steel had some real disadvantages when it was new, but it was the most homogeneous product. So getting back to wrought iron, I made this piece completely out of wrought iron, and I'm going to try to do all of my demo here this week with wrought iron, which I brought with me. So hopefully we can talk about how iron varies from steel, mild steel, and how you have to treat it the same or different, or think about it or not think about it. So let me talk for 2 minutes about what makes this, in my opinion, worth looking at, and that is, we'll go back to this notion of what are the attributes of workmanship in this time period. No hammer marks. This one isn't filed bright, but one of the things about this style of architectural work is, it's really different from almost everything I see anybody making today. Look at the way the parts are joined you know, there's a joint here, there's a joint here, there's a joint there. Can you see how the thing is joined? Not from where you're sitting. So Abana members know that the only proper kind of architectural work is put together with collars, and if it doesn't have collars, it's a piece of crap. Right? Isn't that right? Well, this style of work doesn't use collars. Collars were a Gothic sort of feature, a real quick and dirty wrap that would hold things together. In this context, the collar is a big lump that interrupts the shape. The collar is detrimental to the aesthetic because it's a big glob that got thrown onto the design. So the intention here is to create these lines without interruption or without contamination by the mechanical fastening. So all the joints in this case are pinned. The pins are tiny. Often they're pinned into countersunk holes so that the pin head is almost completely invisible when you're done. So that's the first thing. You want to create a piece that doesn't foul the design by how it's made. And then the other thing that's really important, I think, about understanding this is that the design of the piece is linear. So I can, well, where's the camera here? I can follow a line in this piece all the way from here to here is one line, one unbroken line. The opposite of that, in my mind, would be if you made 10 scrolls and rearranged them on the table and then stuck them together. That's maybe a pattern, a texture, but it's not linear. You're filling an area, but you're filling it with a repeated pattern. In this case, you're filling the area by drawing an unbroken line through it. And the thing that makes it, to me, appealing and more sophisticated is that that line has many side roads or branches that are just as pleasing as the basic line. So instead of going from here to there, you could go from here to there. And if you just took that line out of the piece, it would be a pleasing one by itself. So it's like you have this shape superimposed over that one. Parts of it are a perfect match, but parts of it deviate. And that's the challenge in this design, is to create a design that can be understood in 20 different ways or seen in 20 different ways. So you can look at that shape and branch off in this direction, or this one can be looked at here to here, or you can follow this branch, or you can follow that branch. All of those are by themselves a pleasing kind of shape with its own integrity. You took that element, you take this, you take this little pass-through element right here, the two scrolls, one passing through the other, and you look at it without anything else around it. It should be an interesting, pleasing form all by itself. And it should also make a pleasing junction with the other forms. So not just stuck on, and it's not stuck on almost in line. This line from here around there should be a good scroll, as well as this one. So every component should be have its own integrity without having to be within the overall. So that means everything has to happen in the right place. So this one has a mistake. This one has a fault in it. And not everything happens in the right place in this one, but I'll let everyone look at it. Maybe we'll have a drawing later, see who comes up with what I see. It's pretty clear to me, but I've stared at this one a lot. So let's see, what else was I going to say? So because everything has to occur in the right place, everything has to fill the area to give it more of an even texture throughout. And so for that reason, I really firmly believe that these things all had to be drawn out full size before they were made. If you want this leaf to fill that space, you can't have it weld on up here by mistake or down here. It's got to weld on exactly where you want it to so that it fills that space that it has to fill. And so you have to know, where do I weld that on? And you have to know, where do I punch that hole? All of this while you're working at the anvil. And so that's the other part of this project. Yeah?
It may sound stupid, but it seems like the acanthus leaf is universal all over the world. Is that a plant? I've never seen of that
Yeah,
plant.
it is a plant.
What is it?
It's called the Acanthus Plant. They grow in the Mediterranean. I've seen them in Greece, but I've never seen one in America.
Okay, I just was kind of curious because
Yeah.
it seems like a universal leaf and
Well,
work all over.
yeah, so this is not, I don't believe this is really an acanthus. These are called water leaves. But the acanthus leaves are one of the components in one of the classical orders of Roman architecture.
So it just kind of grew out of it.
Right, and a lot of these styles were derived from classical Roman forms. There were several big revivals. People would go to Rome or Italy and discover the ruins there, and they'd come back to England and say, wow, you'll never guess what I saw. And then there'd be this great trendy revival of Roman principles. And so a lot of these forms are based on that. Yeah.
How is the structural strength integrated into that, to support that layer or that marble slab?
Well, it's pinned here, and you have essentially a diagonal brace from here to here. It's a crooked one, but it's still there.
So that was thought of as they were designing.
Yeah.
Peter, could you talk about how you treated the punched holes, because you don't see any?
Well, yeah, you can feel them.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's another feature of work of this era. Nowadays, if I was going to distill this down into a couple sentences, I would say the modern fashion is to emphasize the distortion of the material. And in my jaded view, I see it's emphasized so much it's there even when it has nothing to do with creating the piece. So, in contrast, in this time period, you want to de-emphasize the distortion of the material. And so after you punch the hole, you squash it back down a little bit.
Did they use bobs to do the countersinks, or did they cut them?
Oh, use a bob. Yeah. I don't think I brought one with me, but that's so much faster than cutting them too. It's one blow with a hammer in the same heat that you've done the punch. So
Doesn't that generally bring that?
not much. Yeah. All right. So my plan was not to make a whole one of these this morning.
Oh, come on, you can do it.
Well, I know. So,
You just put it in the slide tub, right?
yeah, the magic slack tub, yeah. But I thought I could do sections of this in the next couple days. So this section right here in the corner might be a good one. It's got a leaf, 2 different size scrolls, the pass-through, a couple of welds, so that would be a good one. I know there's always a lot of interest in how to make this nailing pad. We could go through that. That could do on Friday. And I also brought the tools to make the water leaves. So if anyone has any other urgent requests, we could consider those too. Yeah.
I noticed those square corners are.
Oh, yeah, we could do this. Like here. Yeah, I could just do that by itself without necessarily making it into the.
The nailing pads, would they ever forge weld that on?
I make that section separate from the legs. I weld the legs on, but I don't weld a plate on.
But would they ever have done that?
I don't know for certain because there's absolutely no evidence that I could find on the originals. I can tell you there are a couple things about working back then that changed the decision making a lot. And first is, I don't think there was ever a smith that worked alone. You always have a helper and a striker, essentially. So things that might be challenging to beat out by yourself were not an issue. They're working with wrought iron, which is really soft. With a good striker, I think you can make that section in about 4 heats. And then 2 more heats to weld on the legs. And, you're off and running. So 20 minutes. A lot of people today, it would take them 20 minutes just to get up the energy to get started. So, but it's a whole different decision making when you have a helper.
Could be riveted on too.
That's takes longer than forging it out. You got to punch 2 holes and make sure they line up. If you don't have a drill press, it changes everything also.
When did the drill press come into being?
Well, there were drill presses back then, but the real question is, when did they become popular, or when did they supplant punching? So there were a lot of things that had to be drilled back then because precision location was important, like clocks. Clock cases were drilled, not punched. Watches, gun locks, all the holes in the gun lock plate are drilled. So they either have a brace, you have a brace, they have bow drills, spins the drill back and forth. They had essentially,
Bow drills for iron.
oh yeah, yeah, for small pieces. You're not talking about gates or railings here. We're talking about stuff that's less than 1/8 of an inch thick. Well, it's a brace. It's a brace with a heavy weight on it. And that's called a beam drill. And we use them sometimes. So you could drill with that beam drill. It's just a big brace with a heavy weight on the top. And all you have to do is turn it. But we could drill sort of a 5/16 hole through a 1/2 inch in about 10 or 15 minutes. It's not like a modern drill press, but you could make the whole thing yourself and make the drills and drill a precise hole, which you need maybe once every 2 months. You don't need to make, so what I'm going to do today is show you how I achieve another challenging feature of this, which is no two scrolls are the same size or shape. That's another aesthetic feature of this style. You don't have the same scroll repeated 30 times. You have a different size here than here. You have a different size here, here, here. They're all different. And so you can't make a scroll form for each one. That'd be ridiculous. And you can't do a test piece for each one, because each one is, you'd be making 2 of the brackets instead of 1 that way. So you have to have a method for making each of these come out the right way the first time.
Have you hold it on that up here for the camera?
Yeah, but you can take a shot of it later on the table if you like. That might be better. But you need my thumb in there for scale. All right. So that's the last thing I'm going to do is go over some method for how you get things to happen in the right place. All right, so we better get started or we're going to all doze off here. So any other questions before we do? All right, so I've got some wrought iron that I brought with me. I started resizing it last night. This was 3/4 round bar. So I'll show you what I've got to draw this down. And I'm going to start with this section here. So if you guys want to stretch your legs for 2 minutes, refill the coffee, I'll be able to get started on this.
Time out, or did you do test pieces?
No, I don't do a test piece.
So that you just said it, you made that from scratch.
Yeah.
And that's how it turned out.
Yeah.
And then how did you get?
Well, I had a drawing to work from.
Okay, so I was going to ask, you drew the original?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll show you how I go from the drawing to this.
He makes it so smooth. I was watching the woodwright shop the other day.
Yeah.
Roy showed something that I had never crossed before. He was talking about working in inches. He said he was in Denmark or something, and he had a Danish inch scale. And the Dane's inch is a different size than an English inch. And it's slightly longer. It's like 1 1/16 inches. And so a Danish foot was 12/16, 3/4 of an inch longer.
Yeah.
He said so, and he had one of those, folding, 6-inch scales. It was Danish. And we opened it up, and they didn't match. He said, depending on where you are in Europe, you got to make sure of what you're measuring with.
Yeah.
But it never occurred to me that an inch was not an inch. Because, if it's the length of the king's finger or thumb or whatever, they had a different king.
Yeah, right. The boy king.
Where did you find your wrought iron?
I find salvage, scrapyard.
It's been tough to find some.
Off-road axles.
Yeah.
Road and wax and Wrought-Iron.
I gotta get to the hammer.
Oh, okay. Oh, you're getting serious.
Yeah.
Hogs up.
I'm amazed, you're doing it just like the old school. You even gotta resize your material. You just
Yeah.
don't go to the rack and get what you need.
Right. Well, there's not much on there that's one size.
Yeah, exactly. You're talking about your piece, not all of it's one size. So you literally have to, it's not like going, it's all 3/4 inch or whatever. Oh my.
No, that's all resized stock.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm gonna go the anvil here.
What do you think
Are you gonna need a striker at all?
Well, maybe not. I don't.
I'd love to strike for you.
Okay. Well, the only thing I might need, if we do this nailing pad, I'll need a striker. So.
I've
All right.
For a lot of people, I'm not a bad striker.
Okay. And when you hit the anvil, you don't leave a dent.
I didn't. I got lucky.
You. There's not much better qualification than that. So far,
Good.
as long as no one pays any attention to what I'm doing, I'm great.
Oh my God, everybody's paying close
Well-
attention. That's great. Good stuff.
Yeah, I can shut that off, I think. Well, actually, let's turn it on again. All right. That's time to do a little more talking. All right, I'm going to start with the, you want to grab anyone that's curious. I'm going to start explaining how I do the layout.
Peter's going back to work. If we were southern, would we banging on the bayou?
What's that? Okay, so how do we start with a design, a drawing, and figure out how to make all the parts come out in the right place and the right size the first time through without a lot of trial, testing, redoing, without a lot of cutting and arc welding and grinding, without a lot of...
Were there grinders?
Yeah. Well, they were big sandstone wheel grinders. They weren't die grinders, but there were big surfacing machines for blades and...
I thought they made Vaders in the 1700s.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Only in Germany. No. So the other thing is, if you don't have an electric drill press, you can't make all of these things and clamp them together with a vice grip, and then just drill through where you think the pins ought to be. And often the holes, like this hole, is not at a place in this element where you could punch after the element is formed. That hole has to be put in before all this other stuff happens around it. You have to know, how do you know whether you're putting that hole in the right place or not when you punch it at the anvil? Because it has to line up with the hole you pre-punched in the frame. So how do you figure out where the holes go as you're doing the forging? And how do you tell if it's in the right place and without a lot of aggravation later? So you got to start with a full-size plan that you can measure from. And when I made this one, I had a drawing that was full-size, and I didn't bring that with me, so we'll just pretend this is the drawing. And we'll work from this and try to duplicate it. So I'm going to make this corner element. I have to start from somewhere. And for this case, I start from one point and I work my way around the element. So I could start from here and work my way around, or I could start from here and work my way around the other way. So I'm going to start from here and work my way out. And I don't know, I think you could probably do either one. This one, starting from the center and working out, there's no waste. You don't have anything left over to cut off and throw away. And the other valuable part of this method that I'm going to use is that there's no mathematical calculation. I don't have to, so for example, if I started from here, I have 1/2 inch by 3/8 material. How much longer is that going to get by the time I get to here and I have 1/8 inch by 1/2 inch material? Plus I'm welding things on in different places, plus I'm punching holes. If you can estimate how all of those things are going to determine your stock usage, that's great. But the method I'm going to use doesn't need any sort of pre-calculating.
Peter, on that long line that you described earlier, you're going to do it in several sections and weld them?
Yeah.
Where does your eye tell you you should be doing those welds?
It doesn't matter. I mean, I know I have to make a weld here. It's not the, well, let me see how to say it. There are some places that are by virtue of the process make it easy to do the weld, to join to the next section. It has nothing to do with the design. So I'm going to start at the center and work my way out. And I know from experience about how much it takes to make this rolled up snub. So I'm going to allow that much length in the bar to roll up. And then I'm going to measure from that snub around to the next thing that happens, which is welding on this leaf. So I'm going to measure, where are we, from here, and figure out how long it takes to get to there. And I'm going to do that with my compasses. I'm just going to walk my way around the design. All right, so let's do that. And I'm going to get a rough idea, because of course the compass is not measuring the arc completely. All right, I'll say 1, 2, 3, whoop, 4. This is really slippery. 5.
You left some hammer marks in there, you got a little mark around.
Well, this is, I put a finish on this and it's really slippery. 1, 2.
Peter, what did you use for the finish on that?
I used Penetrol, which is a paint additive.
If you didn't set your dividers, you just opened.
Well, I did set them to 1 inch. I did. And that's going to be useful in a minute.
Would they have used metric system or?
No, no. They had high standards. They refused to use metric back then. All right, so here I've got this laid out, right? That's easy enough to see. All right, so got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Well, that's handy. So if I imagine that section unrolled, and what happens at 12 inches? The leaf joins, right? I know it's hard for you guys to see because it's on the camera. And then I know from looking at this that we're at about 1/8 there, and we're at, well, I had this, we're at that much where the leaf joins, which I'm going to say is 5/16. So just by looking at either the drawing or the object, I can make that section perfectly. And since I'm starting from here, I'm just going to work my way back until I get to that point, and however much it stretches is however much it stretches. I don't have to know that in advance. If I started from here and went the other way, I wouldn't know exactly how much stock it would take to get all the way to the end. But starting from the thin point, it's easy. So I did some of that while you guys were standing up. I drew out some of that taper, right? So let me just continue on with that. And so I can set my compass All right, so that now is set to that. So I can just have this at the anvil, and I can just keep drawing it out until I get to that length. Yeah?
You said you knew from experience how much you needed for the snub.
I'll tell you.
Oh, okay.
So, let's say you didn't have any experience and you wanted to find out how much do I leave for that snub. So I'll show you how to do that. So let's say we don't know how much to leave, but I've got my bar drawn down It's almost drawn down. Let me draw it down a little more, and then we'll. So again, this is wrought iron. I'm going to do what I would normally do with wrought iron. Well, I mean, I'm just going to work it the normal way. So you watch, and if anything looks odd or normal or curious, speak up. So I think, and see, I'm working down to a red heat so that there's no need to wire brush. No need to wire brush. All right, and I'm going to trim the end flat. Right, and now I can start rolling up the snub. So let's say I don't know how much the snub is going to take. We'll just make an arbitrary mark, 12 inches.
Is there a reason you have a flare? I mean,
Yeah, I'm going to do this one a little different than this one. Yeah, good eye. So 12 inches right to that step mark. That'll be easy to keep track of, I think. All right, so now we'll make the snub.
Can I ask you said 12 inches mark, but you have the additional scroll.
I'm sorry?
how he's
Then
going
you're
to
gonna
measure.
measure the 12 inches after you do the scroll. Are you gonna measure the 12 inches after you do your scroll?
Well, I'm going to make the snub and then measure what's left.
Okay, the 12.
Out of that 12, how much did I use to make the snub?
Oh, I got you. Okay, I'm sorry.
So just by coincidence, by some really confusing coincidence, I picked a 12-inch arbitrary, and it's also 12 inches up there, but they're unrelated. So, yeah, because I knew that could never happen, that's why.
Yeah.
So now we'll start rolling over the snub. I want to get this to roll nice and tight. Yep. Well, what's that? I think so.
You can't make them in Wrought-Iron the other way.
Right. Yeah, they break pretty easily if you try to make them solid. I get it at the scrap yard. Occasionally I find people that know they have a bunch of it for sale, like they've taken down a building. Yeah. All right, so how do I know when to stop? I could just roll this all the way up to here if I wasn't paying attention. How do I know when to stop?
When it's the size
When
you
it's a
want.
size that's pleasing?
When I get to the 12-inch mark?
No, when it's the right size, and you decide.
Yeah, when it's the right diameter, snub. So, you decide how big a snub are you trying to make. I can go a little more. So yeah, you can see all the incredible math that it takes to do this. Yep. I think I'm going to stop about there. All right, so I have a snub that I think is adequate size. And now I'll just measure what's left. I got 9.5 left. So I used 2.5 inches of that material to make that size snub, assuming the next one I make is the same thickness and taper.
I'm confused. I thought that mark was arbitrary. Were you being smart aleck?
It was arbitrary. I could have marked.
Now you're measuring it, you know you've used 2.5, so I don't follow how you know that.
Well, because that arbitrary mark happened to fall at 12 inches from
So
the
you
end.
knew that that was at 12?
Yeah.
Okay.
I knew that was 12, but it
Okay,
could have been 10 3/4 or,
So you knew the distance, but where you put it was arbitrary?
yeah.
Arbitrary, okay.
You just start with a known amount of material
Gotcha.
that you know is going to be too much. Yeah.
Okay, so because you had experience, you had your 1/8-inch dimension at like.
Where, about how far back from the end? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you have to do that once.
Once, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Did they ever forge with a stop block to get it real even?
I'm sorry?
Did they ever forge with a stop block to get a constant thickness?
I don't think so.
Okay.
If you're good, you don't need the stop block. And you're not trying to make a constant thickness either. I'm making a long taper.
No, I just meant for like, the top bar and the bottom bar.
They're not a constant. So this tapers from 1/2 inch thick down to 3/16. And to me, that is one of the really important details in this work, is that nothing is a constant. Everything's always changing, and that's what makes it more intriguing. If this whole thing was,
Both dimensions. Those taper in both dimensions.
yeah. Yep. And, and then there are other things you can look at also. You notice how the weight of this section, what's added on is much lighter than the weight of the main body. This is much lighter than that. The individuals are lighter than, just like in a tree. The trunk is heavier than the branches. And that makes it more interesting also. You're varying the line weight and the line thickness. If you make if I made all these parts out of the same size material, I would have a beautiful execution of a machine-made thing, or a cut and paste thing. A lot quicker, but this is executed for someone who understands the subtleties and understands why the cut and paste version is not what they want. Yeah, someone had a question. Yeah.
You emphasize not needing to wire brush. Is that opposed to working with steel? Is that what you're
I don't use a wire brush with steel either.
Okay, so working to the red heat is what?
Yeah, just work, you do your finishing at a low heat, every heat.
Okay.
And that means you have to, well, maybe not every heat, but you have to, when you see that you're getting close to finishing a section, you make sure you complete that section at a red heat. You don't say, oh, I've got 3 more hammer blows, I'll just get another yellow heat, do the 3 hammer blows, and then I'm done. That's no good. You either rush so that you can get that done in this heat you're in, or you reheat it to a very low heat, do your little bit, and then you're at the low finishing heat. So it means you have to control your heats. So there's always a drawback to this, but yeah.
I found that a lot of people don't know why they like what they like, but when it changes like that, it's more pleasing.
Yeah, that's more intriguing.
They don't understand
Right,
what they're seeing.
exactly.
They just know they like it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I mean, that's the same with all kinds of things. You can feel that way about something you eat. It's delicious. You have no idea what's in it. You still like it. So that's, if you are competent, you can design in the things that appeal to people that don't know why they like it, but they do. You don't have to appeal only to the people that are just as knowledgeable as you. You can appeal to the other people that are not in your field, that aren't trained in design or aesthetics or, yeah, and so that was the big argument we always had with our management at the museum. We would say, it's really important for us to be doing real work in our demonstrations. And the management would say, well, most people don't know whether you're making something real or not, and they're not going to watch the whole thing. And my argument was, if you're just pretending to work, people can sense that, even if they've never seen this before in their life. You can sense when someone is doing something for real and when they're pretending, even if you have no understanding of the process. And so your credibility only comes from doing a real thing, even if the person watching has no idea what you're making. And that's true in the execution too, I think. You know, people can go watch a wooden ship being built. If they've never seen one before, they can still tell whether the guy making the parts is really doing it or not.
If you go to Vegas, you know it's not Paris or whatever.
Yeah.
Paris and Venice, it's real.
What? All right, so now I'm going to go back. I'm going to work back 12 inches from there till I get to where the leaf is going to join. All right, so I have.
Right. Have you erased your first 12-inch mark?
I'm about to. Yeah. Anyone want to take a picture of that mark before I erase it? Oh, thanks. Ooh, the heavy stuff. Thank you. I'll probably get to use it pretty quick. All right, and just because I don't want to run out of time, I'm going to make the leaf also while we're working on this. So this is a really common style of leaf. Here, 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 here. It's all the same shape. And I think it's what people now call the blown over leaf. And it's a very easy leaf shape, but if you do it well, it's a really graceful this one's probably the best executed one on the piece, you know, how it just kind of, just like it withered into a perfect shape. So this is where I'm doing the smoothing and just straightening. I know a lot of people say, oh, you can never hit iron cold. But there's a lot of stuff you can do when it's cold.
Peter, I'm curious, is the wire brush comment a personal thing that you don't like to do? Does it have a detrimental impact on the aesthetic of the piece? I'm just kind of curious.
Well, I find that people that wire brush instead of doing this rarely achieve the kind of surface that's possible this way. Because a heavily scaled wire brush surface is full of pitting, and it's a very rough surface, as opposed to, you know, this is, I mean, it's hard to get that kind of a finish just by wire brushing. And often wire brushing takes up an important part of the heat. How much people wire brush stuff when it first comes out of the fire, and you lost the best part of the heat, the part where you can accomplish the most in the entire heat you've given up to the wire brush. And everything after that, you're going to have to work harder and harder and harder.
Wire brushing, period correct?
No. No. So I think it's, with better technique, it's unnecessary. It's really, I mean, gas forges are probably a reason where it's more important, more useful. And I find wire brushing is important when you're heating a piece and not changing it much. What I find troublesome is, you know, that's a situation where it's really useful, but people get to the point where they are convinced you have to wire brush something every 15 seconds no matter what you're doing and no matter what you're about to do to it. Then it's lost its meaning. It's just a, you know, OCD habit. Yeah. So no, it has a value, but it's so here's a good example. I'm changing this so much, all the scale that was on the thing has gone off immediately. Why would you have to wire brush that off to start with?
Understood. Absolutely.
So we're at the spot, but still a little too thick.
Excess for 12. Will you be leaving it heavy for the forge weld?
No, I haven't gotten to the weld area yet. Well, I don't know if you can see the drawing, but so my 12 inches comes right up to the point at which the weld happens. All right, so let me make the leaf. Here's the leaf. All right, so how long do I need to make this leaf? Well, I'm going to do basically the same thing. I'm going to calculate how much, 2.5 inches roughly. I want all right, 2.5 inches from the point that it welds to the bar to the tip. All right, I've just taken that off the thing or the drawing. Well, I know I have plenty there. Let's see. Oh, well, got a little too far. All right. All right, so there's my leaf ready to weld on, scarfed. All right. So I have a choice here. All right, so the leaf is going to go on like this.
Is it?
Yeah, good question. Is it? Which side do I weld it on? I'm going to weld it on the same side as the snub.
The leaf goes the other way, doesn't it? Oh, no, okay, never mind.
Leaf goes on the same side
Yeah.
as the snub.
I was thinking backwards.
Yeah, well, it's important. It's useful to think backwards sometimes, and makes you double check. All right, so I know that it's going to go on right at that little bump, and it can help sometimes to know how much of this leaf gets welded on 2.5. So that's about where the weld should happen. So if I line up those two marks, that's how it should be positioned on here. And so now I have a choice. I could cut this, weld this onto the end, draw it down, then weld on another bar. But since I have left material on this side of the weld way oversized, I also have the option of just laying this on, drawing everything out together, and not risking the area beyond the weld becoming too thin. So let's do that, because that'll be very different than the others we do. All right, so you could, I don't care how you hold it on there. You can tack it on there, you can rivet it on there, you can wire it on there, you do whatever you want. If you don't want to do anything out of the context, you can just hold it on there with a pair of tongs. I think we're going to have to get this down in the fire a little bit. Well, we'll see if the fire gets hot up tall enough. Let's try this magic stuff. Where did my This leaf is about the hardest one to do this way, being clamped with the tongs, because it's so short. If it were 6 inches long, it'd be easier to clamp the tongs on it and hold them there while it was heating, but this one's really short. Yeah?
Do you not need to clean off the forge scale before you
I don't do that. I don't clean it off with mild steel either.
Mild steel?
Yeah,
Just a flux sort of glass overlay?
just the flux will do it.
Yeah, that's great.
But if you like wire brushing, this is a good excuse.
Do you ever make your own flux?
I've tried. Well, I tell you, one flux that's easy to make that works really well is just to use borax and make a bunch of drillings or turning swarf out of wrought iron and throw that in with the borax. You have little chips of wrought iron mixed in with borax.
What did they use for flux?
I think most smiths didn't use anything. Yep. We're getting close. Let's see if I can at least get them to stick here. Okay, now we can go to town. So I end up using flux all the time. Well, most of the time. Just put a little borax on here. Draw this down above the leaf a little. It's starting to get hot. Yeah. Yeah, if it's welded, you do. If it's welded, you can treat it like it was always a solid bar. If it comes apart, it wasn't welded. But the other thing that helps too, just a second, get this while it's hot. Ooh, that's the right heat. Anyone notice what that sounded like? On the first blow, I like to call it the wet sponge. Now, so we should have 12 inches to the beginning of the weld. Well, it's close. Yeah, it's within the realm of imagination. It is on one side. One side looks perfect, the other side looks horrible, but all right, so see how it's welded right to the point, the 12-inch point that I had hoped for. So I won't show you the other side. Yeah, I have to preserve some level of mystique. Yeah. So often what happens if you get tentative, the weld it goes out that far. So you take another heat and you weld up more until you get to that point. Or if the weld were at 11.5, then what do you do? Draw it out. Split it open? Yeah, draw out this part a little more. Easy, easy peasy. So if it's too short, it's easy to fix.
Peter, when you had it in a fire, the leaf was right there on top the whole time, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, till I got it stuck, then I could rotate it. But I never put the leaf down. All right. So what I have sort of matches my target dimensions. So I'm going to blissfully go on thinking everything's fine from the center all the way to here. Right? All the way to this point should be to dimension already. And then the next thing I need to know is, there's a pin there. So that's my next, what I call landmark. That's the next thing that has to happen on schedule, is that pin. Is there a pin here? No. You could put one there, but it's unnecessary. You could, that's more OCD. You pin everywhere something touches somewhere else, you pin it. But it's not structural here. And I made this in 1990 and it hasn't sprung open yet. I think we're over the worst. Yeah. Yeah. So if I really worry, I can see light through there. That really bothers me. I can't hardly sleep sometimes. Anyway, so now what I'm going to do is measure from that point, my first landmark, to where the hole goes for the pin. I could measure from all the way to the end, but I just can leapfrog from mark to mark and get pretty close. So let me do that. We'll measure where we have to be. And 1, 2, 3, looks like 4 1/4. 4 1/4. Two, 3. Yeah, I think 4 1/4 will do it. I'm sorry?
That divider measurement, do you keep that same unit for the whole project?
You don't have to. No, in fact, it would have been more precise if I hadn't. It would have been more precise to measure this really tight part of the scroll in with half-inch divider setting. Will give me closer to the actual linear. And then when the curve gets big, I can move out to inch without any distortion. No, you could do each landmark with a different unit, wouldn't make any difference.
Are you measuring down the center line of the stock?
Yes, yeah, always. Yeah, you only measure down the center line for all of this. So everyone knows what that means? Yeah. All right, 4 1/4. I think I have 4 1/4. Yeah, set here. So what I need to know is can I find the right starting point? Well, that's still a little bit big. So sometimes one thing I have done, and you're welcome to do also, I think, is you can make these landmarks a little more definable. Oh, that was a bad idea. There, that's better. All right. How could I have done a thing like that? So by following this same procedure, I can tell approximately how thick the stock needs to be at the hole. So I can make sure I've drawn the bar out to the right thickness there. And it's that, whatever that is. And I guess I'm going to need a punch. Still a little heavy. All right, now we can punch the hole.
You have a favorite size pin for this?
I'm trying to remember. Well, I think for this stuff I used, well, I know this is going to sound like, oh no, not another thing to do, but I usually forge the pins myself. I don't start with standard stock size. So one reason there's an advantage for doing that. I can make, instead of making a pin that has a real head on both sides, I can make a taper essentially and drive it in from one side, and when it jams I just know where to snip it, and then I can peen, leave an extra 16th and peen that out, and it's going to be tight in that side of the hole without a head, and then the other side you can use to fill the countersink. So you can make a pin that's really solid and not have to make sure that all your punched holes are uniform size either that way, because you're driving a taper into it. One hole's a little bigger than the next, it doesn't matter. So each time you use a standard size something, it means everything else that goes with it has to match that standard size. So if I were to say I use a 3/16 pin, then you have to make sure all your holes are the right size for a 3/16 pin, which is not impossible by any means, especially if you have a drill press. It's easy, but if you're trying to do all this at the anvil and you're just freehand punching, a tapered pin allows for the slight difference between one hole and the next.
Does that also compensate for the distortion bend?
Yeah. Yeah. All right, so here I'm gonna, well, let's put a ring on this. So the way I mark these, you might want to stand up and watch this. So I'll just show you what I do, and then I don't think I'll be able to punch the hole in this heat, but. So I have my compasses set to where the hole is, and I can see where the center punch is that I marked it, and I just scrape across the scale. And I don't know if you can see that. It makes an easy to see line. I know exactly where to punch the hole. I don't have to use a ruler. It takes that long. And then you're ready to punch. So I find that's the easiest way. I don't have to let this cool and center punch a mark and then heat it up again. All that is, this method is to eliminate all of that back and forth work.
What's the material that you punch?
It's awful material. It's just scrap coil spring. That's really bad for this tool, but.
You may think you're sleazy, but it's cheap and it's easy.
Yeah, That's one area I'm really sloppy about well, I have to say when I was at Williamsburg, we were trying to use period correct steel, which would have been 1075. We got used to making all of our tools out of that, and if you learn to use them effectively, it takes a little bit more practice, but now, just for fun, I'm going to punch a little bit beyond the line. Yep, let's see, we can knock that out. Yep, I clipped the punch. So why would I punch beyond the line? Well, if the hole is stretching, I should have punched before the line.
Stretches your curve.
That's why we measure on the center line, because the center line doesn't change when you bend it.
What would you mark on the surface?
No, I use the center line measure. When it's flat, the center line is the same as the edge. Well, that's the most likely, but no, all this area between my reference and the hole is hot. It's going to shrink when it cools. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'd probably get 3/32 of an inch in that. If it was orange, to start with. 4 inches of orange material. So, I mean, it's not going to make or break the layout. Okay, and now what do we do? Now we go on to the next. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll say 4.5. Okay, I'm going to go with 4.5. Right, and this one, for the sake of all kinds of things, come on. kick that over here. Yeah, good. So, welding on this leaf, I just stuck the leaf on to a long bar, in the middle of a long bar, welded it on and drew out. When I make this weld, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to weld the two together with a stub end and then add the next section.
Why did you decide to do it that way?
Um,
Rather than putting it on
yeah. This would be the normal way. You weld two pieces together, maybe leave an extra 1.5 inches or so, and then weld on the next, because you can upset the piece you weld onto it. Well, let me start over. So the answer has to do with how do you keep the next section from getting too thin? It's not about this weld, it's about the area adjacent to the weld. In this case, my parent bar was so much larger than the final size that I could just lay that on, weld them on, and keep drawing out beyond the weld by 50%. So there was no risk of this being too thin after the weld. If I had the right dimension bar all the way to here, I couldn't just lay this in the middle, weld it on. Well, I know Francis did it all the time, but it's harder to get that to come out to be a smooth flow. So I had extra material next to the weld here to work with. Here I don't. My blank bar is not very oversized. And so I would worry that just laying this on and beating it down, by the time I got the weld to seal completely, I'd be too thin. So by jumping on a separate piece, it's much easier to avoid getting that area too thin. First of all, you've got way more than you need because you've doubled it here. And second, you can upset the piece you're going to stick to it easily. So it's, if that, if you can pick either way depending on what you think is the safer. And then there's some cases where you really, well, like it's really hard to put these leaves in the middle of a bar. First of all, it's the leaves wrap around the core, so if you're doing it on a short section, you can just slide them on the end. But if you're trying to wrap that leaf in the middle of the bar, it's a nightmare. Get it to wrap the right way and have the right shape and end up in the right place. So normally those, you do that with a stub and then weld another piece to it. All right, what am I doing here? So I'm going to do, while we're this far, I'm going to start curling this up because might as well get, so I'm going to do about 10 minutes of that, and then will be a good time to stretch your legs, and I'll start prepping the next pieces. All right, any questions otherwise?
Pete, you didn't really answer my question.
You had a question?
I don't know when the metric system
Oh.
started. The question was, did they use metric in England and we came up with something different then, or did it change?
The metric, I can't remember when someone will know. The metric system originated in France. I think it was after the French Revolution. Part of the kind of the rebirth of Is that right? Someone's got a phone, they can tell me everything in 30 seconds. But the American colonies continued to use the English system, which was inches. And England didn't switch till 20 or 30 years ago. So yeah, we used the English system, which was inches, feet, miles, pounds. The French system was touted to be based on the natural world, I believe. It was a percentage of the circumference of the Earth. Is that right? Does anyone know that?
Oh, yeah, I remember.
Yeah.
Okay, I just really didn't know.
Yeah. So the metric system was in use in France not long after the American Revolution, but wasn't adopted in England or the English colonies or in America for quite a while. Someone's got a phone; they can give us all the answers here instantly.
First proposed in 1670.
Mine says 1791. No, that's where it was first.
Oh, imposed but resisted.
In France.
The metric system they have now, I guess, 1790, set up the system. Goes by
All right, so I'm going to scroll this the same way I rolled the snub, just not go so far with it. All right, and I brought these handy dandy scrolling tongs, which they're basically a variable size scrolling wrench. So now is when the work of making that taper nice and clean pays off. Because if the taper that you forged is lumpy, when you start to curl it, it bends at the thin spots. If it's a nice even taper, it will make a much smoother bend. I suppose I ought to look and see what I'm trying to do here. And the other thing you might, oh, I got to go much tighter. Much tighter. The other thing you might notice is I'm just giving it maybe 1 or 2 taps and then I look at it. Don't go like this and then look at what's ruined. Just give it and then look, and then you just go a tiny bit at a time.
Japanese proverb, the eye of a master craftsman does more work than both his hands.
Oh, that's a good one. Now, I probably won't be able to tighten this up enough. Oh, that was the perfect bump. So here's one thing that these are really good for is undoing a little bit. I can just, oh, that's got to get way tight. Another thing I have noticed about this, which is easy to say, but a challenge to put into practice, is if you get, let's say you do what I did. You start this scroll and you, after you get a ways done, you check it and it's way off in size. It's much easier to adjust the size of that scroll if it was a clean curve to start with than if it was a lumpy curve. It's almost impossible to change the size of it. But once it's a smooth curve, you can do that without spoiling the curve. So even if you think you're just roughing it out, rough out the nice smooth curve, because it's much easier to adjust it later. All right, I've got a bad spot in there, but I'm going to go on anyway. What's that? On the card. On the tape. I guess we got to talk faster.
Peter, have you been addressing that other dimension, as the planarness of the scroll?
Roughly. Yeah. But yeah, that's. Oh, good. Maybe we can go this far. So you can see I've got heat all the way up past the leaf. Well, not quite far enough past the leaf. So when you have a section like this where I have a core and a leaf, you got two parts. It's important to focus on the core first and make the core true. So I'm just ignoring the fact the leaf is there at this point. This whole thing has to get a little tighter. So what am I looking at? I'm only looking at the outside. I'm not looking at the leaf at all. And it's way crooked, just as Gordo was worried about. All right, so why doesn't everyone get a nice refreshing stroll? And I'll screw around with this for a few minutes. And then I will shape the leaf first thing when you come back.